So I'm speaking to my kindred spirits, if you will. I'm a lifelong guide. My specialty has been in the mountains in the Sawtooths. I grew up in the Tetons, and I kind of migrated from both two places. And I love the mountains, but the mountains are also the source for the rivers, right? And I love the river. I like it all. It just fits together so cleanly, and hopefully I can speak to where we're all kind of coming from as guides. So if you want to give me the next slide. This is basically just speaking to kind of where my background is from. I cut my teeth climbing in the Tetons, and so I went to school in the 70s. I graduated from Idaho State University, and the picture over on the lower right is me and my younger self, and just evolving. And my first mentor, H. Hilbert from the Idaho State University Outdoor Program. But when I left the university, I built a yurt to come live up in Stanley. And that's kind of how I got my start here, knowing that I was coming up here to work for the original ski guide, Joe Leonard, and I'll go more into that in a while. But it was kind of that spirit of this area where we call home, the Sawtooths, and the rivers that give rise to it, the salmon, that has inspired my life. So, but originally from the Tetons and getting off the lift at Grand Targhee. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned my mentor, H. Hilbert in Pocatello at Idaho State. My other mentor was Joe Leonard. When I first moved up here, he's the guy in the center, prematurely gray at 38 there. But during that time, I continued to build yurts, and I built several for Joe when I was working for him in the late 70s. Another guy that had a big influence on my life was Paul Petzold, the guy in the center. I don't know, anybody raise a hand to anybody that's heard of Paul Petzold before. So he's an older guy. He started NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School, but he was originally from Twin Falls. And I just really embrace all the Idaho history that we have that actually went other places in the world. And he went on to form the American School of Mountaineering in the Tetons, which was the predecessor to Exum Mountain Guides in the Tetons, and that's after having come from Twin to climb the Grand Teton in his cowboy boots with his brother. And then the next year they set up shop at the foot of the Grand Teton and said, hey, we're as good at doing this as anybody is. And so this is Paul Petzold in the 1930s. This happens to be a summit shot of myself and my client, Ben, and just lo and behold, made my day when Paul Petzold was up there sitting on the summit of the Grand on his last climb of the Grand Teton. And so that really holds something really impactful to me in my life. So next slide. But this presentation is kind of built around several sources that I used. The Off Belay magazine that was back in the 70s that was published. It was kind of the definitive work of what went on for climbing in the Sawtooths. This book here, Sawtooth Stanley Country, that from Ed McGowan and Nestor Yarborough. I still refer to this book, but this is an awesome book for people that want to know a little bit more about this area here. As well as Give Me the Hills, which is written by Miriam Underhill. And then Matt Leideker's book on the Sawtooths. He's written as, a lot of you guys probably, who knows Matt Leideker? Yeah, he's of the river running ilk, so I would imagine that a lot of you guys know Matt, but he's done an awesome job with just sourcing out information in the form of these usable books, and he has one on the Sawtooth, so definitely a good resource for me. Idaho, a Climbing Guide, that was Tom Lopez's attempt to write everything about all climbing in the Sawtooth, throughout Idaho, of which I'd say at best is dubious, because there's just been so much done in this, in Idaho in general, by just people like ourselves who just go off and do things and they don't ever write it up. and more in the spirit of adventure. So when he took a stab at trying to kind of define what's gone on, as I say, it's not what I'd consider a definitive work, but there is a lot of useful information in there. The Sawtooths themselves, I don't know, can we adjust this? I don't know if we can or not. Yeah, well, everybody just use their imaginations. The Sawtooths, I thought I'd just speak to that a little bit. I mean, it's a glaciated range that was formed 55 million years ago. The present day shape that you see the mountains in, it was through an active alpine glaciation period that was fairly recent, in the last 7,000 to 25,000 years. So in geological time, fairly recent. And perfect. It's primarily granite, the range, and it's the two types of granite that are in the range are the Idaho batholith and the Sawtooth batholith, and you basically can differentiate the two when you're back up in the Sawtooths by their color. The Sawtooth batholith is a pinker granite, and the Idaho batholith is more of a tan granite. They also, in terms of their composition, particularly here in the Sawtooths, I would describe the Idaho batholith, if you run into it, it's going to typically be more ball-bearing in texture. And the harder granites are the pink granites that oftentimes they also have lichens growing on them. And one of the reasons that they have lichens growing on them is it's a more stable form of granite. And so when we're climbing around in the mountains, we pay attention to rock color a lot. You'll go a long way as far as differentiating what's solid rock from not solid or rotten rock. But lots of classic glaciation. It was an uplift. And then through that active alpine glaciation is what gives it the U-shaped valleys like you see. This is from Redfish Lake there. Also the spires that, because of the vertical faulting, there's a lot of just coulars and spires around here, and that's a result of the fact that we've got a lot of vertical cracks that run through the range, and so that's what gives this range its unique character. But it's really a classic glacial shaped range that has a combination of just tarns and swarms and reds and all that other stuff. So next slide. So to the history itself, a guy by the name of Dave Williams is the person I would, and you can read all about Dave in this book here. I credit Dave with being the original Sawtooth mountaineer. He was born in 1880, but they moved originally out here from Pennsylvania, he and his brother Ted. But they homesteaded in the central area of the valley, the Sawtooth Valley near Fisher Creek, and where Idaho Rocky Mountain Ranch is. That was all where the Williams brothers ended up. The Williams Creek was named after his brother Ted, but Dave was active as a guide, and he specifically guided the Underhills, who were world-class mountaineers from the Tetons. And this goes back to, hey, what's this relationship between the Tetons and the Sawtooths? Why do people come from the Tetons and go from the Tetons and come to the Sawtooths? And it's just kind of, the Sawtooths are kind of everything that the Tetons aren't. But they're a really nice kind of combination of the two places. And so the Underhills decided to come over here and hire Dave as their guide, and that was mainly, they were very accomplished climbers. They climbed all over the world, and but they needed somebody to provision the trip so they could explore the range, and so they came to Dave Williams, and they left his ranch in Mid-Valley there on horses. In the first year, they were here in 1934 and 1935. And the first year, they headed up past El Capitan, leaving from the ranch around Hell Roaring Creek, and then went over past Snowy Side. It was specifically because they'd heard of this feature called the Red Finger, which is it's the Rakers over in the South Fork of the Payette. If you go up out of Grand Jean, it's a very impressive spire, and they wanted to go check out this red finger. So in the first year going with Dave, they did that first loop where they ultimately ended up climbing Snowy Side, but they also made an attempt on the red finger, and this is Miriam up on as far as they could get, because if you go up to the North Rake, you'll see that it's a very difficult monolith that has no cracks, and they just figured it's unclimbable, so they weren't able to scale it at that point. But along that first year, they did climb several of the other peaks along the way, including Snowy Side, and then they end up over in Mount Reagan out of Sawtooth Lake. And so they enjoyed the Sawtooths for their charm. So next slide, as Bob writes in Appalachia Journal in the Sawtooths, I think there's quite a lot here to engage the interest of the rock climber who is willing for a moment to turn aside the longer expeditions to shorter days spent largely in the lighter exercise of his craft, and preferably one who is content to accept as part of the reward the great charm of the country and the camp life it permits. And I think any of us who have spent time in the Sawtooth say, hey, what's so unique about this place? It's just, I know when I first started visiting the place, it just felt like I was running around in Elfland. You know, there was just all these charming little alpine lakes and beautiful spires. It wasn't the immensity and the scale of everything, it was just the charm of the area. And I think Bob caught that. Bob Underhill caught that when that's the comment that he made about coming to the Sawtooths. But a little bit about the Underhills. This is a picture of the Grand Teton and the North Ridge on the Grand in the late 1938. Bob Underhill and Fridtjof Fritzl climbed the first ascent of the North Ridge of the Grand, and during its time it was considered the most difficult climb in North America. So this is 1938, so he's over here poking around in the Sawtooths with Dave Williams, and yet he had done all these kind of other things, and it was just like, hey, we want to change of pace, we want to go to some place where I can just kick back with my wife and do a lot of just scoping things out. And so the Sawtooths were that nice juxtaposition from doing things really world-class to just coming back to a place that really has a special charm. Okay, next slide. So they hired Dave. This is a picture of Dave and his wife Carrie out on a goat hunt. And as I said, even though Dave accompanied him on a lot of these climbs, he's said to have taken his shoes off when the climbing got really difficult and just climbed barefoot. But Miriam's comment about Dave was that she was reminded how much he was like the Swiss mountain guides, because they were all goat hunters. And so they were really comfortable cruising around in the steep terrain, but he didn't trust the skinny ropes. So Dave never really used to like to tie into the rope, because he said, I'm not going to trust my life to that thing. I'll just hold on to something. So that was how Dave approached mountaineering. But in any event, there's tons of information in this book that I just pointed out, and there's lots of rabbit holes I can end up going down. And so I have these little questions marked, and so if there's anything coming up along the way to say, hey, more on that subject, you can just, I've got prompts there of things. Well, what about Brother Tom? How about the nasty Batcher Dick Horseman Peak's name for it? He was nasty because he was a bachelor, and he didn't ever take any showers. And so the women in the valley all referred to all the bachelors in the valley as nasty bachelors, even though they were all good cooks, and they'd all, very hospitable. And there's, of course, Emil Grandjean, all these guys ran around together. And so more on that subject, or you can pursue it in this book. Okay, next slide. But Paul Petzold, who I'd alluded to earlier, he'd come over here also from the Tetons. He was hired by the Iowa Mountaineers to be their trip leader. This is in 1947. And Paul was self-taught. He grew up in Twin Falls, as I mentioned. That's young Paul in the center. I'll get my laser pointer out here. And as I told you the story already about him going over and climbing the Grand Teton with his brother Eldon, and then setting up shop as a climbing guide the following season. But Paul Petzold from Twin Falls had a tremendous impact on climbing in our country and mountaineering and a lot of outdoor education. And he's a local boy, and so he was hired by the Iowa Mountaineers, next slide, to specifically climb Mount Hayburn. That was on their hit list. And so he made the first ascent of Hayburn, and Hayburn has two summits. This is the east summit and the west summit, and he went up the couloir to this notch and then climbed out of it. And I call it the notch route. I've gone up there and checked it out. We were able to climb it free, but it's you can see the old hardware in there that when he originally climbed it in 1947. And he also went over to Warbonnet and did the first ascent of Warbonnet Peak, which is in the center of the range. And this is a picture of the summit block of the final end. At the time, it was considered by the Iowa Mountaineers, they really wanted to write this thing up, say, hey, this is the most difficult climb out there. It's among one of the most difficult climbs in 1947. So people were starting to kind of, the Sawtooths were starting to be noticed a little bit in the mountaineering world. But back to the questions, I mean, there's plenty of things behind this story of Paul that I can speak on if we're talking over a beer or a cup of coffee or something on a more casual basis, or if you want to, at the end, go back to one of these topics, we can talk more about it. So, Louis Sturer is another one he's someone I actually met when I first came here to start working as a guide, and he was based out of Sun Valley. He was one of their public relations people because he's such a charming man. He was originally from Hungary, and but he loved climbing, and he loved the Sawtooths, and he came. That's a picture of Louis over there on the far left, and unfortunately he fell to his death soloing Mount Ebert. This is the Fishhook Creek and Horseman Peak and Mount Ebert in the distance. He was off soloing and he fell off the backside in 1989, and I was out guiding at the time, so I never had a chance to say goodbye to Louis. But he did a lot in terms of, for just being an ambassador to mountaineering in the Sawtooths. He hung out at Redfish Lake a lot. He'd meet people. If there was ever an issue, somebody coming through there that was asking questions at Redfish Lake about the mountains, they'd invariably call Louis up, and Louis would kind of, be the guy that would kind of help just, answer questions for anybody, just super available to people. But he loved climbing around the Hayburn area. And when I first got up here, I started exploring Hayburn. I said, why the hell would anybody climb around here? Because the rock's not all that good, And when I came to the Sawtooths, I really said, hey, I'm going to find where the good rock is and not screw around with any of this bad rock. But he did, for one, I think just because of its proximity to the lake, he loved going there, and he did a lot of mountaineering and exploring around the Mount Hayburn area. But in addition to that, he also climbed, next slide, the Splinter Towers, which were near Warbonnet, Hayburn. He did the Northwest Ridge off the Bench Lake side of which there is a little bit better rock there. And then he also climbed, did exploration of the Finger of Fate with his buddy, Jerry Fuller, and so I did a lot of pioneering through the range. But Louis, my stories with Louis involve a moonlight ski tour with him. Louis's advice for me when founding Sawtooth Mountain Guides and suggestions for people that I should tap into to just utilize the local talent. And so when I started the company, that's kind of, he was one of another one of those people I would regard as a mentor. But I mentioned this magazine off the lay. This was kind of the first attempt at trying to put all the information for Sawtooth climbing in one spot. And they wrote dedicated the whole magazine to the Sawtooths. And they did what they thought was a pretty complete, thorough job of just giving somebody a fairly overview of the range. And there was a guy that was living in the valley that helped do that over in the Sun Valley area. His name was Ben Bachman, no relation to myself, but he wrote the article with the editor of Off the Lay, Ray Smutek. And after this thing came out, there was a lot of pushback from the local community because there'd been a lot of people who had been climbing up here and really enjoying the charm of the range, and they really liked this whole kind of style of just coming and going and just having this thing in your back pocket and not really calling any attention to it. And so when this article comes out, the folks in Ketchum, all the kind of local ski patrollers, and say, hey dude, you just let the cat out of the bag. And they literally ran Ben Bachman out of town. And so that's that local pushback. They talk about, it's like, hey, we don't need a guidebook. There's guidebooks on all these other ranges, and you say, look what's happened to them. And so like, let's leave it chill here in the Sawtooths and just leave it open for adventure and exploration. And that's what I would say was the advent of an ethos around here, what we call quiet pioneering. And that is you just go in and you kind of do your thing. It's not to say there's not any good bait out there, but you can kind of just keep it under your hat and just kind of keep it on the down low. And so that ethos of quiet pioneering is something that I think is really unique to the charm of the Sawtooths. Next slide, please. So in addition to that, I mean, just kind of painting a little bit more of a picture of the past in terms of what's gone on in the Sawtooths. There was another guides service before Sawtooth Mountain Guides, Idaho Mountaineering, and it was run by a guy by the name of Lyman Dye, who was based out of Idaho Falls, and he'd come over here, mainly doing a lot of youth group type climbing. He did a lot of scrambling in here, didn't do really high-end climbing, but he definitely got around and explored some of the range. There was an informal club of people that they had formed at Gordon Webster, Ray Brooks, called themselves the Decker Flats Climbing and Frisbee Club. And this is a picture of Joe Saviors, who's one of the people, the charter members of the Frisbee Club. But that kind of spoke to, hey, let's not take climbing in the Sawtooths too seriously. Let's just have fun. But they got around as well. But they should go. You know, the Decker Flats Climbing and Frisbee Club should be mentioned in of what I consider my perspective on the history. Bill Echo, who is an Idaho Alpine Club, he had a friendly competition going on with Louis Sturr the whole time, specifically around that Habron area, climbing a lot of the towers. There's a picture of Bill Echo doing a Tyrolean traverse from one spire to the other. And then the Iowa Mountaineers had a significant imprint here. They came out and did long trips in the Sawtooths, and they'd always hire trip leaders, of which the original one was Paul Petzel. But I would say, as importantly through all of this, is the quiet pioneers, of whom there are many, and several who are sitting in the audience today. You know, people that have just been out there in the woodwork climbing. Okay, next slide. But that said, this fairly notable figure, Fred Becky, showed up on the scene. Has anybody who are climbers heard of Fred Becky? So he's an older guy, so I don't expect the younger generation necessarily to all know Fred Becky, but Fred is one of probably the most prominent alpine climbers in the United States of the older generation. I mean, he wrote a guidebook in of the North Cascades. He's been all over the world climbing, and he died he started as a dirtbagger and he died as a dirtbagger. And as it relates to dirtbaggers, climbers are notorious for being dirtbaggers. and there's a story on Fred Beckey on Netflix if you want to, and it's called The Dirtbagger. You want to get on Netflix and learn a little bit more about Fred Beckey. That's a good thing to take on. But one of the things that Fred took on is like, hey, he had heard the Underhills had been up and checked Red Finger out the North Raker, and they never summited. So he would always, I'm going up there, and I'm going to be the first one to do it. And he did it in 1949 with Pete Schoening. They were out of the Seattle area, which is where Fred's from. And so he climbed the Red Finger. That's the picture over there on the left. He happened to pound a lot of hardware in there, and just aided his way up it and left the hardware there and said, been there, done that. Then he also climbed Big Barren Spire, which is also known as Old Smoothie, because it's a very prominent peak. Anything that hadn't been climbed, Fred Beckey wanted to climb, but he didn't by whatever means. And he also did a climb on the Elephant's Perch called the Beckey Direct, and all you have to do is go up to the Elephant's Perch and find a tree up there about 3/4 of the way, and then drop a plumb line on it, and that's the Beckey route. And so Fred got around, and he made his contributions to Sawtooth climbing as well, and he died in 2017. So he had an eye for good lines to climb, but he would do it by any means. And so wherever there was a Beckey route, it was never any harder than 5'9". Anything harder than that would just have aid attached to it. And so in any event, next slide.
He's also the one who had the sign that says, "Will delay for food."
Yeah. Classic dirtbagger. But so the Elephant's Perch, now we're talking about climbing more in the modern era here. And the Elephant's Perch has really quality routes all over it. I mean, the feature itself is 1,200 feet in length, and it's the most Yosemite-like piece of rock in Idaho here, and it's gotten a reputation of people are coming from all over. These guys over here, I was out on the boat dock with them. These are two guys going into the perch from Norway that they'd heard about it. These are a couple of people there. I said, I looked at their rack and I saw the ropes. I said, so are you guys going to climb myopia or something, you know? And just one of the harder routes. And they said they weren't sure what they were going to do, but you knew they were going for something fairly stiff. And then I ran into these guys, and this is just in the course of 20 minutes out on the dock at Redfish. And I was visiting them, and they're going in to do the Mountaineers route, which is a pretty reasonable, it's still a rock climb, but it's a pretty reasonable route. So people are coming from all over there without us doing anything at all to promote the place. Good news gets out. And so that's what's going on at present date. But along the way, I mean, I've done a fair amount of climbing over the years here, and one of the guys I ran into was this guy named Reed. Anybody heard of Reed before? Okay, well, Reed, I would add to the history of the area here. Next slide. I characterized Reed Dowdle as the Sawtooth's humble rock climber. He's just a really understated guy, a wealth of information. He's totally got it down as it relates to the ethos of the area. He doesn't call attention to himself. But he's done a lot of pioneering on not only the Elephant's Perch, but on other places. These are some big rock walls in the War Bonnet area over here by Barren Falls. So there's a ton of, in addition to the Perch, there's other places in the range where you can run into big steep walls, and Reed has managed to do them all. This happens to be on top of summiting on Big Barren Spire there. That's a picture of Reed summiting out there, but you would never know this because he's such a humble guy. He's raised a family in Haley. That's his wife, Robin, and his kids. But I don't know what I'm doing.
If you hold the mic.
Uh-oh, that's going to be even more trouble. Okay, I didn't do well the last time I was told to hold the mic. Okay.
Pretend it's a beer.
Okay, thank you. Nothing's coming out. But in any event, Fred Surf Reed's couch. And so if you want to know more about some really good stories, go look up Reed Dowdle. He's a wealth of information. And talk, all I can say is he's still around. And so talk to some of these guys that have a little history in their back pocket with some of these notable characters. Next slide, please. One of the things that Reed did, though, is that he took the time to hand draw what we call topographic maps, which are just breakdowns of routes, pitch by pitch, and what kind of difficulties you're. So everything he climbed, he would sketch it on a piece of paper, and he created a catalog of all the different routes that Reed's happened to do, and he kept it down at the outdoor shop, the Elephants Perch and Catch 'em, in a 3-ring binder. But ultimately that ended up on the internet without Reed's permission, and that didn't sit real well with Reed. And so that all the things that he had taken the time, because he felt it was proprietary, he would share it, but you had to go to the perch, and then somebody zero copied it, took it to a copy machine, and just put it all on the internet. And so that's where it is now. And so that's helping to change the character of the Sawtooths, just because all that information's now on the internet. Next slide. So I kind of showed up to climb here, as I say, after kind of going back and forth between the Sawtooths and the Tetons. And it was my main deal was just to go knowing what the difference between good rock and bad rock was here, and try and spend time sourcing out where the good climbing was. So this is a picture of the super slabs out of Redfish Canyon, Goat's Perch, Eagle's Perch, Chipmunk Arrête, all of which are on good rock. And so I spent most of my time just trying to find where the good rock was. Next slide. In one of the areas where in the 70s, when I first kind of started coming to the Sawtooths, I spent some time in this area, in the War Bonnet area, where there's a number of towers. This is War Bonnet Peak here, and then these are what they call the lunch towers. We did a route up this ridge here that I named after my dog, Jaffe, and I called it Jaffe's Ear. And this was when I was reading a lot of Jack Kerouac and Dharma bombs and all that kind of thing, but that was just to give you an idea where my headspace was at the time. This is in the 70s, you've got to put this all in context. But I had my dog back in there, and I was reading Jack Kerouac, and I was just enchanted by how much of a Zen garden it really was back there. And this is a picture of Japan Peak, what I call Japan Peak. It's called the Mayan Temple by most people. Some people refer to it as Japan Peak, but that's what I called it. And this is the same peak, but the point being that as you move around, the perspective just continues to change. And so I thought, this is so Zen gardeny, and given where that I was reading Kerouac and all those kind of things, you can see kind of where this place name business was all coming from in this era. And as I say, this is back in the 70s. Okay, next slide. But I had probably the most history with this peak. This is Horseman Peak, and one of the reasons you can see it from the range, from town here. It's got what we call the sickle couloir, and it's very distinctive. People ski it, which is this feature right here. And then we did a route up this skyline and ended up climbing and finishing it up in the moonlight with my buddy Rico. But I've just spent a lot of time over there, and one of the reasons I spent so much time there is because it was a little bit more Teton-esque in that the roots are longer there, like they are in the Tetons. The rock's not particularly good, kind of like it is in the Tetons. You pull things off and suddenly you're dealing with rockfall. But I have a number of different stories there, which you can pull me aside and we can talk about it. And I say probably the reason I had a relationship with that peak is because I skied by it so much, coming and going out of the huts here in the Sawtooths over the years. So, but lots of different activity still goes. On a big year, this snow field fills up. We refer to that as the shield, and that's just modern day what people are up there now, skiing off a fairly exposed slope that, you know, if it does go, it's your toast, you know. But that's just, boys will be boys and girls. That's just what the modern culture's doing these days. So anyway, next slide. But I told him, originally I had kind of put this show together for the history museum there in the Sawtooths, and I said, I'm not going to do anything on the climbing unless I can include the skiing, because I think that we're far enough down the line here that it really should be considered part of the history of why people come up here and poke around in the mountains. And there was a guy by the name of Joe Leonard, who I'd mentioned earlier, who was kind of that original guy. He was based out of, he moved up here to Stanley, but he was originally based out of the Robinson Bar Ranch. And Joe was the ranch manager, but he was the guy that kind of got the whole free heel, go back into the backcountry thing going. And when he wasn't doing that, he was teaching people how to roll kayaks in the hot springs at Robinson Bar. And so he was also kind of one of the first guys to kind of pursue a life on the water, and specifically he set up Leonard Expeditions Kayak School. So he had a summer-winter gig going, one part of the year on the river and part of the year up in the mountains. And his mountain, as I say, everybody has a mountain. And for Joe, it was always going back up to Sawtooth Lake and trying to climb Mount Reagan in the wintertime. And so that he finally pulled that off. But like a lot of things in mountaineering, a lot of times you don't do it your first time. You have to be willing to go back and do it. Maybe you're not there under the right conditions. But in any event, Joe Leonard is somebody that I would consider, you know, on the timeline that folks ought to know a little bit about. Okay, next slide. So this is a picture of Joe, and I got introduced to carrying heavy packs from Joe because all of the food that we ate up, and he put the huts in the Sawtooths. He originally had one at Goat Creek, another one over in Iron Creek, and had one over by Marshall Lake, and then we'd ski out Fisher Creek right by Horseman Peak. And I worked for Joe in the late 70s and kind of learned the ways, but at that point we were all skiing on really shitty equipment. I mean, things were breaking left and right. Nobody that we were guiding really knew how to ski. And so this is a classic ski tour in the Sawtooths where guys don't even have the skis on their feet. You know, they're just carrying the skis, and it's like the goal is to get them from point A to point B by any means. And but I would carry a ski repair basket, you know, that was the size of a large bread basket, just fixing shit on a multi-day hut tour. But in any event, that was my introduction to huts through Joe. And then while I was working for him, he had me build some yurts for him, and so we replaced all his huts. He had wall tents set up in the mountains, and I replaced them all with yurts. I worked for him kayaking, teaching kayaking in the summer on the Upper Salmon, and then for the fine salary of $600 a month, flat. Whatever he could come up with me to do for work, I knew I was going to get $600. That's the only thing I knew. But I came out of there, Pocatello, with a philosophy degree and a Dodson pickup truck that was paid for, and I thought life was good, you know? So I wasn't complaining. So in any event, I built some yurts for him. We put them all up in these 3 different locations. And I have had an opportunity to go back and forth on the ridge for years. Okay, next slide. But Joe wrote a book called, and I really recommend this book, Bob Beckwith probably has read it, but it's The Son of the Madam of Mustang Ranch. And after I read that book, I mean, while I was working for Joe, I really was scratching my head a lot. What's up with this guy? You know, I mean, I thought he was charming as hell. He was very charismatic, but I couldn't quite figure him out. Once I read that book, it all made total sense at that point. So I highly, if you like history, read The Son of the Man of Mustang Ranch, and it's just as it says. Everybody know what Mustang Ranch is? Well, he was the son of the man of the Mustang Ranch. So that ought to tell you a little bit of Joe's background. He kind of came from a wheeling, dealing, drifting, gambling man. That's, if I was just kind of throw some words together, that's how I describe Joe Lynn. But a charming individual, and that's his wife Sheila, and they built that place right down there on the Salmon River. That was his project before he left the valley. But in any event, it gave rise, Joe's efforts gave rise to two companies, Sun Valley Trekking, which Bob Jonas bought the permits from Joe. He located the huts, one at Fishhook Ridge, or Fishhook Creek, and another one over at Bench. So he moved from the original locations that Joe had. And then I applied for a permit to set up the Williams Peak Hut. And I'd already started Sawtooth Mountain Guides at that point, but I wanted to roll it into a winter operation as well. So in 1985, that's when I started my company. Okay, next slide. So we had this hut system, so to speak, where if we were going up to Williams for the hut I operated, we would leave from the ranger station and just go up the Fishhook Ridge, but the whole idea was so that we could ski all this terrain around here. And the Sun Valley Trekking operation had the Fishhook Hut and the Bench huts, and there were ways you could kind of weave around in all these different huts in the Sawtooths and just make a multi-day trip out of it. But the writing on the wall from my perspective was where the sport of backcountry skiing was going, was get to a location and ski your brains out. And so I thought, why not just put a hut in one location where you have plenty of terrain? And so that's why I landed on the Williams Peak location. And fortunately, the Forest Service was gracious enough to grant me a permit to do that. Okay, next slide. I should backtrack. I should just give you a little background here, if you don't mind stepping back. So after Bob Jonas, Joe and Francie Tonsmeyer took over the reins from Bob Jonas, and then Sawtooth Mountain Guides has gone through kind of a multi-generational change, myself starting out, and then me with Harry Lydecker, who still owns the company, but his last partner is this guy, Niels Meyer, and the reason I bring Niels up because he's been delegated the responsibility of maintaining the Williams Peak Hut, so I wanted to include Niels in kind of this storyline. So you have the St. Anges on the one hand that are running the huts that now called Sun Valley Mountain Huts, and he sold the guide end of the business to Zach Christ, he calls it Sawtooth Sun Valley Guides. And so the Sun Valley Trekking thing is kind of continuing to go through some metamorphism. But Niels is the latest on the whole Sawtooth Mountain Guides side of things. But in any event, this is the terrain that we ski from. This is where the hut's located. And you can see when I put the hut here, I started realizing all of this stuff can produce avalanches. I mean, you can see there's a ton of terrain out here with avalanche history. And so one of the things we did in starting Sawtooth Mountain Guides say we have to have a viable avalanche education program where people know how to have the terrain to be up in this terrain. And we still rent the huts out to unguided parties, but we want them to know that they've got a background in being able to be in and around avalanche terrain. So that's kind of why Sawtooth Mountain Guides in particular has kind of always had a really robust avalanche education program, is because we were, providing the range to get people back up into the backcountry to ski in avalanche terrain. Thought the responsible thing to do is just show people how to, be smart about skiing around or riding in this terrain. Okay, next slide. But one of the things you do when you're in avalanche terrain or ski mountaineering is you use a decision-making tool. And in one decision-making tool we're all familiar with is the stoplight, green, yellow, red. It's like, hey, red's no-go and green is go. And you use that as a process to say, hey, is it a good day to go up in the mountains and get exposed in avalanche terrain. And so you're going to say, hey, this is the backside of Williams Peak. We're going to climb and ski this thing. And it would be under conditions where the snowpack you feel is green. The weather is, hopefully kind of on the greenish side. And your terrain is red. It's red terrain. It produces avalanches. And so if you're in red terrain, you got to have green snowpack. And it's just a way for me to explain, well, how do you make decisions as to when is a good time to be up there or not be up there? And I think this stoplight analogy works pretty well. It's just a way to wrap your head around it. The avalanche triangle is another. So here's those items I was mentioning: snowpack, weather, terrain, as well as the people you're with. Do they have the skills to be up there? And so all of this relies on judgment, and as do all types of guiding rely a lot on judgment. But it's just a matter of being at the right place at the right time and making good decisions. So there's times when it's better just, hey, let's just go ski powder on low angle, and there's other times when, hey, let's go do that couloir. And when we go do the couloir, it's because we feel that the snowpack's stable, and I'm with somebody that's also green in the sense that they've got the skills to be there. And this is looking down. In this case, I'm just ooh, ah, kind of nice, relaxing adrenaline. In this case, you've got your tongue in the middle of your throat, getting ready to make the next turn. It's just like, well, what's your risk tolerance? What would you rather be doing? And it depends on the group. So she's keeping me on pace because I know I'm going to snap it up. But anyway, websites. This is kind of a view from my house here. And what I was the Saw and Sawtooth mountain guides. One of my goals was, hey, when this is all said and done, I'm going to have a house here. I want to live here. And so all of my guiding was the primary prize was, when this is all said and done, I want to be able to hang my hat here. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach. It was like, hey, I want to be a professional guide, but I also want to have a place to live. So I managed to build myself a place here while I was looking out at that and running a company at the same time, as well as bringing on really good people to work with. Next slide. And so Eric Leidecker, Matt's brother, joined me. He worked with me for 10 years, and I knew, hey, this guy's got some real talent. And I think guide services work based on the quality of the guides that they have working for them. And I mean, hats off to you guys, because I think the lion's share of the people that are in this room are guides, and that's what makes operations work. But in that case, Eric was my talent that I brought on, making good selection on personnel. He worked as a guide with me for 10 years, and then I sold him half the company. And along the way, we were all doing this training that involved working through the American Mountain Guides Associations and getting certifications, because in mountain guiding, that's the track I went to, because guides work so much on their own, they're required to be their own risk managers. When you work on the river as a crew, you can do that as a collective. But when you're working as a mountain guide, you have to be running the risk and managing the risk on a standalone basis. So for that reason, in mountain guiding, a lot of training has resulted. And I kind of got in on the front end of that ship has continued to build to where it's now part of the American Mountain Guides Association. It's part of the International Federation of Mountain Guides, and you can see that all of these guides that are younger than myself have Sarah Lundy. A lot of you guys might know Sarah, an awesome person. She was 8 years on the dance floor as an owner at Sawtooth Mountain Guides and decided she had a different calling in life, and so she stepped out of the ownership role. But that said, she's still an awesome guide with 20 years experience. Mark Hanselman from Haley is also another person that's been around there a long time. And then some of the other guides, Drew Daly and Matt Scribner, are also people that have spent a lot of time with Sawtooth Mountain Guides. And then the latest iteration of Sawtooth Mountain Guides, as I mentioned, is Nils. But these guys have all pursued their training. So Eric is the master trainer. He is very involved with all levels of training at the international level now. So that's just how guiding from the time I came onto the scene, and then of course even looking back further at the original pioneers, Dave Williams couldn't have perceived any of this. You know, this is how this thing has evolved over time, and this is where it's ended up. This is Margaret Wheeler and Matt Farmer, both newly moved to the area, but again, these are all fully trained guides, and so as Eric's role has really been stepping up the whole training program at Sawtooth Mountain Guides from the time that I first conceived of the business. This is Eric when he first came onto the scene. I took this picture of him while we were up on a climb on the Elephant's Perch. This is the younger Eric without all the badges, but this is kind of just a tour down memory lane. I mean, some of the old guides that Julie Meisner, you might know, she's one of these folks that's worn a lot of different hats in the guiding world, including working on the river. You'll still see me out skiing powder out at Copper. Bill Lavelle, who's still doing some hiking. He doesn't do any. Dave Bingham, and then some of the younger brig, Doug Bernard, Amy David, and there's several of you folks in here, JP, Jamie, all of whom are professional guides that are in the audience here. I can't put everybody's picture up on these shows. I just grabbed a few. But then people that were back in the woodwork, Jeff Rhodes, he's moved on. He's a cinematographer for NBC Sports, and he's summited Everest 3 different times. You know, he lives in Salt Lake. Josh Nelson's a school teacher in Pocatello, really good around kids. Pete Patterson, there's probably just someone over that just by virtue of pure experience, even though he doesn't have any badges, is just one hell of a mountain guide. Chris Lundy, who's super psyched because he's no longer an owner of Sawtooth Mountain Guide, so he's happy. And he's back to forecasting avalanches, what makes Chris happy. And then Matt Leidecker, you all know Matt. Clark Corey's an IT guy. Michael Hatch, Amy Barnes, these are just some of the folks. But the stories are really what it's all about. You know, this is John Platt, who recently passed away. He's a very prolific person out of the Boise area that's done in Tom McLeod. They've been all, and these are just examples of somebody who the hell is that? It's like there are a ton of people around, I can't even begin to tell you, who have done really cool things around here, but they never called any attention to themselves. So it's all about the stories. Here, that was some of the material we used to actually build this structure that the yurts are on. Those 2 beams out in front that are part of this tree. So we just dropped it in that direction and used a lot of additional native material to kind of establish the hut. But it's, I guess it's just part of the firewood that has been used, and the place has been maintained by a bunch of guides and people, dedicated personnel of Sawtooth Mountain Guides over the year. We've had a lot of help, firewood cutting. Niels Meyer, who's one of the current owners of Sawtooth Mountain Guides now, his addition was this wood rack, and he's the new, he oversees that part of the business now. So been a lot of history over the years, but I mean, the biggest part of having a hut operate over time is kind of the dedication of the people that have put time in here because they're passionate about the hut location. You can see the terrain around here, lots of great ski terrain. There's the lower end of Thompson Peak there, and some of the terrain above that kind of leads up to the skier summit. All the various slopes around here, you're really literally in a backcountry ski area. And the huts facilitate being able to stay up here for multiple days on time and just enjoy powder skiing, or maybe when conditions are stable, head up into the higher alpine terrain and explore
couloirs and summits on skis, and that's all what people do during the course of a winter season.
Hey Kirk, you're at 12.
Yeah, let's just keep
Skip
rolling.
ahead to something.
We'll roll it out here.
Okay.
Okay. So, the year 220, the year that hammer came down, we had COVID. What else? Any earthquake? Yeah. Okay, next slide. So we had this magnitude 6.5 earthquake. This is the shot right around the Pete Williams yurt, and Chris Lundy's up there when this thing happens. And so this was, for him, a really amazing thing for him to be able to see this. All the cracking that happened right around around the hut itself. Next slide. And then a huge avalanche cycle that resulted because of all of the earthquake activity. Next slide. But also what happened is some things that people had been climbing for years. The arrowhead, which you can see from everywhere in the range if you were anywhere near it. The summit of the Finger of Fate, this block fell off. Several things changed when that earthquake changed. And so Eric was, Lydecker and a couple of the guides were out there skiing, not this last winter, but the winter before. And they were, when they were out touring, they happened to find the summit block laying down here with the piton that you would clip to make the final summit move. When they were on that tour, and needless to say, that will excite a guide. Old Smoothie, the Big Bear and Spire, that summit block fell off in August from an aftershock. And so that's that formation without the summit block on it. So that was a big year for how things change in the Sawtooths that particular year. Okay, next slide. And then there was a block that allowed you to get over to the summit of the War Bonnet summit that was down in this notch that fell out and made getting to the top of War Bonnet a really kind of fairly tricky rope maneuver in order to do it. But Matt Lydecker went up there. If you want to click on that slide. This is just one of Matt's videos when he was up there, and he managed to get the rope to the top because it's become quite a thing. But this is their rappel back off, which I know that he was able to figure it out because they were able to get his clients up to the top and back down again. So in any event, that's just kind of a tour of some of the things that have been going on with mountaineering. Okay, next slide. So we finally got this, a bow on it. These are just some folks that I talked to and collaborated with in order to put this whole thing together. And it is about all the people collectively that we all share these experiences with, and including my dog and my wife, Kelly, who now is who I mainly do stuff with. So next slide. But finally, I can't leave a show on the Sawtooths without bringing the attention and the role that Redfish Lake has played over the years, and the owners that have all facilitated a lot of coming and going across what I consider the best trailhead in the world. If you can get on a boat and go into the other side of the lake and walk into these mountains, I mean, that's all through the goodwill and cooperation of the folks at Redfish Lodge, the Cleggs who currently own it, Jack and Patty C., who were there for well over 20 years, and this is a picture of Robert Lindbergh, who along with Dick Nasty Bachelor, Horseman, built Redfish Lake Lodge. So that's the show. Thank you.